Hey folks, it's Shane from Performance EV. Today we're going to sort out our wiring. Hey folks, welcome to the channel. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you new to this channel, this is my project to put a Nissan Leaf motor into a Porsche 911. And if that's the sort of automotive craziness that you like and you're not already a subscriber, please consider subscribing. Over the last few weeks we've been looking at a range of different things, both around the battery and then getting data in the car in terms of the new head unit and that. And I came to realize that some of the wiring that I'd actually taken quite a lot of time to initially design, I think quite sensibly, had over the past few months, just through me trying different things and experimenting a bit, had really it had become a mess. There were wires hanging down all over the place. If something went awry, it would have taken me ages to actually troubleshoot it. So I decided I'm going to get that sorted, and it turned out to be a way bigger job than I thought. I thought it was just going to be stick a few connectors in place, but I ended up redoing a lot of the work. So I'm actually recording this intro after doing the work. But we're in a much better place. I've started to kind of integrate the control systems for the inverter into the car, and that means that we're in a position where it's much closer to actually looking and acting like a real car rather than some home-built thing with random switches all over the place. So hopefully it won't take too much longer to get it 100% buttoned up, but I think this was something that had to be done and I couldn't really put it off any longer. So yeah, come join me as I go and try and figure out how to actually integrate the inverter and drive system into the Porsche. So the first task in any wiring job is to figure out where you're actually going to do the wiring. For that, you need to be able to access the various areas. So I need to clear a couple things out of the way. So in order to get all this wiring plugged in, the main things that I need are basically 12 volts. And obviously I need to ground things, but there are ground points all over the place. I don't have a problem with that. To get the 12 volts, I don't want to have to run a whole bunch of new wiring, so I want to reuse as much as possible the wiring that's already in the car. Because actually there's a whole bunch of it that's not used anymore. So these are the things that used to power the various engine electronics. So I need some things that are going to be on as soon as the key gets turned into the accessory position, and then a couple things that are triggered once it goes past that into the start position. So in order to do that, I need to find the relays. I figure that's a logical place to do it. I know there are two relay boxes in the car. There's one for the kind of DME relays, so the main engine electronics ones, which is towards the back of the car, and then there's one for a lot of the other stuff, which is towards the front. So we need to find them. So the one at the front is in the footwells. Anything I've read says driver's footwell, but that's all been American cars, so I want to just check the passenger footwell on my side while I'm down here, just in case it's in there. Otherwise it's something that does actually move with the side of the car the steering wheel's on. Okay, I don't think it's this side. Let's go check out the other side. Okay, so a lot of this wiring will still actually stay. I'm just going to shove it out of the way. Basically these are more signal wires than the kind of just plain 12 volts that I'm trying to access at the moment. So the relay block is in there. I just want to see if I can get it to come down a little bit so I can see the back of it. Alright, so I've identified a couple of unused fuses in the front, which I think I can use for just basic switched live to some things, just to get 12 volts available, but only have it available when the car is actually on. And now I want to see if I can find one or two of those back here as well, closer to the motor, and also see if I can find a start live, so something that will only provide power when the key is switched all the way to the right and into the start position. Obviously that's basically going to be my starter motor relay. I just want to see if any of these will fire based purely on the signal from the key without requiring anything from the DME, because I don't want to have to mess around with that. Don't need a huge number of wires, just need one or two, so let's see what we can get. So I'm going to call that a partial success. I was kind of working on the assumption that there would always be power going to this, and that at a certain point a signal will be sent to send power to the coil to then close the relay. But that particular signal must be controlled by the DME, so we're not getting anything like that because there's nothing plugged in, and if it was, there aren't enough conditions being met for us to actually start the car. But what is interesting is there is actually the power that gets sent to the starter is actually only available to this relay when the start button's switched on. So it must be a combination of two relays, one to provide power to here, to make power available to the starter relay should the control computers of the car decide that everything looks okay with the engine, it can be started, in which case they'll send the power to close the relay, and that will mean then that the power that's being temporarily supplied to this pin here is sent to the starter. So I was expecting to basically find power here when I turned the ignition switch to the start, but actually it's up here. Not a problem, I only need it for a second and I'm not sending any great power through it, so actually I'm not too fussed about actually having to wire it up to a relay. It's a low voltage, or not a low voltage, but a very low power signal. So we'll probably end up using this to send the start signal to the inverter when I turn the ignition to start, but we'll go testing through that. Okay, so I found a couple of sources from the fuse box that will provide permanent power when the key is in the ignition basically, or at least in the accessory position. And then I've also found one source of, I guess, start power, which I use to switch the motor on. So I think we've got everything we need to be able to actually partially wire the inverter controls into the car properly. The only thing I won't have in the short term is the drive controls, so forward and reverse. I'll still use my switch panel for those, but for getting power to the inverter and switching it on, we'll use the power from the battery rather than the power from my secondary battery. So the first thing I want to do with this is basically just run a couple of wires slightly haphazardly around the place to test the theory, make sure that it works, keeping an eye on the inverter the whole time and see what we get through, and then assuming it does, I'll start to take panels off and get things wired in properly. Alright, step one is get in behind here and just access the two main wires that I've been using, and we'll get them out first. So that's basically a positive and a ground. Alright, test one. So basically we've got the car now wired into this switch, so 12 volts. Once I turn the key will be available through here. I'll be able to send it out to the inverter, and as long as we're willing to wait a few seconds we should be able to see what happens to it on the screen. So let's go for it. Alright, so nothing coming from the inverter just yet. Let's try switching it on. So this isn't actually triggering it to go into run mode, this is just sending power to it so it runs as normal. And once it runs, it'll make the Wi-Fi available and I can start to see what's happening inside it. Alright, so for the first time we've now got our inverter running on the car's 12 volt, not on its own separate battery. So that's an awesome step forward. But it is currently in off. So if I now flick this switch on, it's now in run mode, but because we have our switch here off, it's in neutral. So now we're going to try and move this switch out of the equation. We're going to turn the ignition all the way to on and have that trigger the inverter, assuming it's on. So what we're going to try this time is just send power direct to the inverter. So I've got this switch on already. This power switch has been removed from the circuit, but we're still retaining our neutral drive and then direction control switches. So let's see what happens. I've already tried to connect to the inverter Wi-Fi from my phone, so it is definitely off. And when we go on, I'll go straight into the browser and it probably will take a few seconds to work. So here it goes. Okay, so I didn't have to touch the panel here. We just turned the key in the ignition, got the car into the accessory position, so the dash lit up and then did its check lights, and now it's just showing basic information. And if I scroll down to the displayed values, we're currently in the off. So the test I want to do here to continue this is to turn the ignition one step further and try and get the inverter to turn on. There we go, it's moved into run mode, and that was just me turning the key all the way to the final position and then letting it back, as if you were turning it to start a petrol car and trigger the starter motor. And if I look down here, we're in neutral. If I flick this value up, this button up, we should go into forward, and then we still have reverse. So what I want to do now is basically make this switching a little bit more permanent. So what I've done for this initial test of the start is to run a cable from the back of the car up to the front to connect with my start messaging cable. But that start messaging cable goes all the way back to the back of the car anyway. So what I might try and do is just see if I can pull it out of the loom that I've created and connect it directly up to the relay point at the back of the car, rather than trying to trigger it from routing wires back and forth up and down the car, because that's just a waste of time. And then I'll use the free spaces in the fuse box to connect up to here. So for the moment I'll keep this this button in place, but I will actually wire this button to the start or to the accessory switch as well. So this is purely as an emergency, shut down all power to the inverter. But we're getting there.
So there we go. 2 new fuses added to the fuse board, both from switched currents or switched positions. So basically, when the ignition switch is turned to the accessory position or further, there's power going through these, and that will be available to the various systems. So some of it will use to go to the systems up the front, power brakes, power steering. Some of it will use to actually trigger power to the inverter, and then others will use to make sure there's power available for the direction control, and also that will be used for things like triggering and charging. So that's really awesome. I think now we just need to get it wired up to the inverter. The other thing I want to do is try and go through our maze of wires here and just improve matters. Some of this is actually basically just carrying that live 12 volts that I'm going to be able to pull from here back to the inverter. So rather than it traveling all the way over there, we can wire it in a bit more simply once I figure out which is which. So first up, I need to do some relabeling of these, because this kind of grew a bit organically from my original very structured loom to mayhem. Now we want to get it back to structured. So this quickly morphed into a much bigger job than I had thought, but we're just going to roll with it. It'll be better when we finish. So what I'm going to clear up here is basically all of the 12 volts and grounds that I've got coming in for the various relays, or to power the software controlled relays. So I'm going to try and cut up some of these wires, get rid of as much of this bundle as I can, and basically send it through this distribution block, which has individual fuses for each item, and then it's something that's nice and neat and can actually get bolted into the high voltage junction box. So basically it's got 2 inputs, power, ground, and then the individual 12 volt outputs and ground outputs. So that should make things a lot neater in here, because it's just a mess. There we go, much neater. Now all we need to do is find a local grounding point to wire to here, and then get our switch 12 coming back to this point. But for now, let's close it up. Off camera, I made one minor adjustment to the circuit here. I added this buck converter, which takes the 12 volts, puts it down to the 5 volt that these little boards need. But apart from that, it's all looking good. So I'm not sure I thought this through all that well when I was first wiring this up. Basically, I've got some wires going all the way to the front of the car that actually I really only need to go about halfway up. So we're going to jump behind the front seat and go and see if we can dig these wires out of my mini wiring harness and make use of them. Slight change of plan. I went and had a look at the back, and I realised, you know what, I'm not happy with where the wiring loom comes into the car. So we're going to rip it all out and put it back through a much more sensible location. So here's the plan. So basically, at the moment I have the cables coming up through this hole here in the base by the seat. Now, to be honest, the hole itself is slightly rusted, and I feel it's a little too low, a little too close to all the action. So what I'm going to do is take everything out through that, ultimately just weld that up so it's no longer got anything going through it, and then put the wires coming up under the rear parcel shelf there, just for both security and to kind of wire them into some things like the 12 volt for the start. So we're going to come up from under here. So this is the left hand back seat of the car, or just behind it. This relay panel sits over it, but there's a bit of space that we can get the cables through. So this isn't actually straight down into the space under the body. It's into a kind of, there's a gap, and then there's another sheet of metal, and then there's the outside world. So I'm going to send a cable down through here, and then use it to try and pull everything back up. So we've got our cable in. Now I just need to unravel it and decide what I'm doing with the different wires. So I'll find a ground point in here for the negative, and then I haven't been able to find any suitable 12 volt live, 12 volt positive that come on when the key is put in the accessory position. So I'll pull that from up at the fuse box where I got the extra wires added in before, and then I'll use the 12 volt that's coming in for the starter relay, which we no longer need, to provide the momentary start 12 volt signal to the inverter. Okay, so this is the only amendment I'm going to make to the loom. Basically this I put in place to take the start signal all the way from the throttle switch back to the inverter, but now that I've got somewhere I can get a start signal much closer to the inverter, I want to plug into that. But what I'm going to use this for then is to send 12 volt from the fuse box back to the inverter when the car goes in the accessory position. So I'm going to just chop this in half here basically, and then ultimately connect it up to the these two wires here for going to the fuse box and to the relay point for the 12 volts. So here goes nothing. So we've made our adjustments to the loom. We've got this ready to go. We've got this ready to go to the relay. This is now going to take 12 volts from up by the fuse board and bring it back to the inverter, and then this I'm going to find a ground point for. So let's get those out of the way, and then we can reroute the rest of the loom. So I've pulled the sender for the throttle, the e-throttle pedal down from its hiding place above the dash, just so I had easier access to the wires without injuring myself. So we'll get a plug wired into this. I'll probably leave the second throttle sensor out of it at the moment, and that way if something happens to the first one, I can always just take the plug apart, put the second one in, and that will give me a bit of a backup. So we've got our new connector wired in, ground signal live, so we'll get that plugged in. We also have some wires in place for our brake pedal that's going to work, or brake pedal sensor is going to work the same way, but I don't have that in place yet, so we'll just keep that to one side and taped off. Alright, let's talk about what we've done here. So we've got nice neat cables going for the throttle. You might remember the bundle of wires that you could see earlier, and basically most of those related to this and some ridiculousness I was doing around it. So that's going up over the part of the steering column and to the left hand side, and it'll basically we'll cable tie it to this side of the dash and to this bundle here, so that will keep that nice and neat. Then we've got our 12 volts to the inverter, so this is when the car goes into the accessory position that the inverter will get 12 volt power. And then we've got a few cables that aren't hooked up yet, so we've got what is basically a spare cable that I can, if I want, plug into here to get 12 volt back to the back of the car if I need it for anything. We've got our cruise control switch, so I may enable that at some point in the future, probably to the buttons on the dash, or not on the dash, on the steering wheel. And then the brake input, so this will definitely be used once I get some sort of pedal input that will let the inverter know when I've hit the brakes. So yeah, so this will all get bundled up here, and it'll hide behind the panel and look much neater. What we've also run then is from the other 12 volt is we've sent 12 volts to here, so that for the moment will go into my panel and provide what was given by a combination of these two switches for the direction, but ultimately we'll get it wired into some switches on here so I can actually put the gear stick in the right position for the right direction. Alright, there's our panel back in. Basically we've deleted these two buttons. I'm going to leave them there because I don't want holes, but power is now only coming to this. It's coming to this after I put the key in the ignition, and then when it comes there and that's off, the car's in neutral, and that's either in drive or reverse. To do now, apart from tidy all this up, is I just need to find a suitable ground point for that, and also at the back of the car. So we found a ground point, nice, perfectly positioned for this. So that's hooked up. Last thing to plug in is our start signal, and then we can just start buttoning this back up.
So that was a pretty big job. It wasn't helped by the fact that every time I came out to work on the car, it seemed to start raining within about 5 minutes, usually while I was kind of head down in some part of the car with my legs sticking out one of the doors, getting drenched. But it's done now. So we've got control over the main parts of the car through using the kind of the Porsche controls rather than random little switches. So now I can turn on the inverter, start it, all just using the key that came with the car. And then it's going to be a question, I think, next of trying to figure out how to get some signals from the gear selector and be able to select drive and reverse and neutral. Because I think then that'll allow us to get rid of any kind of obvious indications that this isn't a stock Porsche, which I think is pretty cool. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it. And as I said earlier, if this is the sort of thing you enjoy and you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing. Hit that like button. Drop me a comment. There's some great ideas put in there on some of the recent videos about the batteries, so they've been really helpful. And yeah, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.